Hello and welcome to another edition of Clock Talk with Dr. Greg Brennan. I am Jim Baker, and today we're going to talk about carbon dioxide.
Yeah, the poison, huh?
So obviously the body needs carbon dioxide, it needs oxygen, it needs nitrogen to sustain life, amongst other things.
Yep.
Kind of walk us through what carbon dioxide does to the body and why it's essential.
Yeah, we hear this whole idea of climate change, carbon taxing. I'm not getting down that path, but we have to understand these kind of numbers. We hear that our climate changed because of carbon dioxide. What percentage of our oxygen, of our air is carbon dioxide? It's 0.04%. 0.04%. And if you decreased it, if you could, to 0.02%, all life stops. It's just mind-boggling to have this natural cycle that we take in oxygen, we let out carbon dioxide, plants grab carbon dioxide and let out oxygen. It's a great cycle, but it's so much more than that. It's biochemistry, it's chemistry, it's the Bohr effect, the Hadlin effect. Hemoglobin, the actual molecule, does two major functions, carries oxygen to tissue and carbon dioxide away. So it's crucial, but the actual proper balance of carbon dioxide has to do with, we talk about our one of our topics, mitochondria, has to do with energy production. And you want to make sure that you have enough carbon dioxide produced to keep mitochondria at it's called a reactive oxidative species, these oxidative stresses at a proper balance. So CO2, too much can be a problem. I understand that because it turns off the mitochondria, but a proper balance is crucial for life.
So the body is expelling CO2, taking what it needs, and it's expelling it. So let's talk about...
Well, that's how that's done first, of how's that made. So we breathe oxygen in.
Right.
We eat food. We eat fat, we eat protein, we eat carbohydrates. And there's there's ways to turn energy with oxygen and without oxygen, fermentation. So inside the mitochondria is the optimal way to get the most bang for your buck. The fuel source, the dollar source, are called ATPs. These ATPs are dollar bills. And for every single function in our body, you need a certain amount, because when you break the ATP bond to an ADP bond, you release energy. Okay? So you got to make those things. When people hear about NDA, those kind of things, it has to do with making that. So when you take in this food source, the carbohydrate, the fat, sometimes protein, if it goes into the mitochondria, there's a thing called a beta oxidation for fat and also Krebs cycle for glucose molecules that can produce 36, 38 ATPs. If in a lack of an oxygen situation, it's for fermentation, inside the cytoplasm and outside the mitochondria, you make fermentation, you get 2 ATPs. So it's more efficient to have the beta oxidation, the mitochondria working properly. But there's a balance between those. And really it's important, Jim, is the amount of free radicals within the mitochondria, called the inner membrane, being balanced properly is enough to stimulate and enough not to, because too much causes these free radical inflammation. So what happens is these proteins, these carbon molecules, they have to be broken down into water and oxygen, water and carbon dioxide. Oxygen goes in, those comes out. So it's this whole process going through this mitochondria called cytochrome C and all this kind of stuff. But it's a process to produce energy. The byproduct of the energy is carbon dioxide. So that's a waste product at the end.
So if you're in poor mitochondria health due to highly processed foods, for example, how does that affect carbon dioxide?
Well, that's the problem, is when you have the bad sources get in there, you may lean more to fermentation, which is less ATPs than you would beta oxidation. That's why fasting, carnivore diet, ketosis is very important, because it pushes the oxidation pathway superseding the fermentation. A little side note, there's a thing called the Warburg effect. Otis Warburg won the Nobel Prize in the 30s. And he showed that cancer cells only grow in lack of oxygen state. Even if they have oxygen, they only use fermentation. So it's called the Warburg effect. And there's a lot of cancer therapies now using that to actually starve cancer cells by going ketotic. So, but it's more important than just being a waste product. We know that right balance is important, because The higher the carbon dioxide is, it's called the Bohr effect, the easier it is to push oxygen off the hemoglobin. The higher the oxygen content is, the easier it is to pull off the CO2, depending if it's in the blood going to the tissue or the lung leaving the body. So these chemical events are based upon concentration gradients.
So is that, if you're diving, for example, and you're taking in too much nitrogen, less oxygen, I think, because most tanks are nitrogen based, and you get the bends, has something to do with
it's the place of the oxygen? Yes, it has to do with, I'm not a pro at that, but it has to do with the amount of, like this room right here is 20% oxygen. A side note on that, you get under 16% oxygen, your brain starts going crazy, starts to starve. When people are wearing those masks, healthy people wearing masks, they were at 19, 18% oxygen within 30 seconds. And it's important to understand that certain cells in the body need glucose for molecules. Now, there are guys on both sides. We have Dr. Mercola talk about the Randall effect, keeping that the amount of carbs you want around 30%, so that the mitochondria knows when to use sugar efficiently and when to use fat efficiently. Brilliant people like Sean Baker talk more about, doesn't really matter, beta oxidation will supersede it. But when Mercola talks about that, he's saying everybody's agreeing when we're all insulin resistant, the bad food, the bad diet, the food pyramid, that all of us are predisposed to be insulin resistant. So once you get that done, what's optimal down the line? That may take years. I read a paper this weekend. It's interesting. The food pyramid was started to America from Sweden first. They brought that up when they were out of meat and out of it was a bad economic time, and people could afford meat and eggs, things like that. So it was another diet. It wasn't supposed to be a healthy diet. It was a way to survive in a low meat state. Really interesting. It's the more you look at it, the more it is dollars and cents. But I can't stress this idea that carbon dioxide is vital to the environment, but vital to the cellular environment to make sure that our mitochondria is more efficient, beta oxidation is more efficient. It's all this slight balance is very important.
So from a simple breathing, if the environment outside has more carbon dioxide, does the body then still get its proper amount of oxygen to be able to metabolize?
Well, the problem is it can start because hemoglobin actually, if it has a preference, it actually bonds CO2 more than O2. So it depends where it is. Okay, that's why it's important. These gradients are important. When you're in the lungs and you're in, we'll call it the blue blood versus the red blood, so the veins leaving the body and getting deoxygenated. Because remember, in the lung system, you're trying to expel the carbon dioxide and replace with oxygen. So when you have too much oxygen saturated in hemoglobin, too much carbon dioxide saturated, yeah, that is how people become suffocated. No doubt about that. But it could also be cellular respiration where you don't have enough, like cyanide. Cyanide blocks the mitochondria from doing its function. So you basically, because that's called cellular respiration, it's same word, same idea that you're suffocating at the cellular level. So it's very important the proper balances. But to label a molecule, a carbon dioxide molecule, as either bad or good, it's the amount, where it is in the body, where location, lung versus tissue, waste product, or being the initiator of proper oxidation. Again, but let's think about these numbers, Jim. Governments are spending bazillions of dollars or taking from the economy to try to lower something that's already 0.04%. And if we have that, like their goals, life doesn't exist. This cycle is we're thrown out of balance. And that's why it's really important to understand the mechanism, what these things do. When they talk about a carbon tax, do me a favor, look in the mirror. You're the tax.
Getting back to the body and CO2, are there symptoms? Can people tell if they're
gasping for air? Gasping for air. It's very, very simple stuff. It's interesting when I was a surgeon before too. Blood in the body is not blue and red, but you could definitely see a not oxygenated color of red. It's more of a purplish hue than a blue because carbon dioxide has a different color on the visual spectrum than oxygen does.
So that's not just gasping for air isn't necessarily just from a cardiac standpoint, you're out of shape.
No.
It could be many more things.
It could be, it's actually the actual membrane in the lung, think of them is transferring oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. So pneumonia, what pneumonia is a barrier of fluid between the cell membrane, stopping that respiration within the lung. Then inside the cell of respiration, if you don't have the right sources, the glucose, the fat for beta oxidation, for fermentation, for whatever glycolysis, gluconeogenesis, or beta oxidation, if those things are blocked, that leads to an inefficient way of producing energy. Because think about this. People know rigor mortis, when you die, you become stiff. Why is that? Because you need to relax. You need to make energy, ATP. And so when you have no oxygen coming in, you cannot make the molecules to relax. That's why dead bodies become stiff, rigor mortis.
So if you are experiencing some of these symptoms, not rigor mortis, hopefully, what can one do?
Well, again, you look at the symptoms. You thought you was very like about the heart, Jim. It's circulatory system, it's pulmonary system. These are systems that are very important for the body, but that's why I think it's important to understand that food is medicine, medicine's food. The idea that what we put in our body is what we're made out of. What we eat is what we are. It really is important. And to understand the process of how the body works biochemically. I'm not saying we need to be biochemists, but that how glucose becomes energy, protein becomes structure, some of that is energy, fat becomes energy, and the efficiencies of these are important. That's why Mark Sisson talks about being fuel flexible. When your body's at its best, it will know when to use sugar for energy and when to know fat for energy because it's flexible. It'll use what's around. The problem is we've been so inundated with this high carb, low fat diet for the last 50 years. What led to that led to insulin resistance, leptin resistance, visceral fat, and then that leads to enzymatic problems like a fatty liver, pancreatitis. Those are end results of metabolic processes that lead to structural defects. So it's important to understand that every cascade has these pathways, and when they're blocked, they back up other ways. So the system must be done properly, and that's why it's important to understand it is just the building blocks of life, and that's your oxygen, your carbon, your nitrogen, like you talked about.
Is there a specific lab test that measures CO2?
Oh yeah, you can measure CO2 and oxygen. You have an pulse oximeter. There's a lot of ways. I mean, when you see the great athletes, when they test their volume output, that's a whole detailed stuff on how they work. Like Lance Armstrong was, some of these great cyclists were just bigger lung capacities, bigger cardiac outputs. Because you think about it, what does the cardiac heart do? It pumps oxygen. So the bigger your heart is, the stronger it is, the more it can pump the oxygen to the tissue and back. So it's just this pump system. So that's why physical activity is crucial to make the pump better. But pneumonia, again, the blockage of the lungs, you're not working out, you're not having elasticity of your vessels. What's high blood pressure? The elasticity is gone. So it takes more pressure on the heart to pump through the system. So it's all these things build up. The core to that, what causes all these problems is inflammation and immune response. These type of things build up, make stiff arteries, stiff veins. They don't have the membranes become, example. If you look at a cell membrane, picture a ladder. You have two rungs between those two poles. And in our body, we'll say the outside rungs are the proteins, and the rungs across are fat. Well, those fats, the right type of fats, omega-3s, make the membrane very pliable, very strong, but still flexible. The omega-6 and the seed oils make them stiff and rigid. So therefore, they're not as good as transferring nutrients, transferring hormones, transferring oxygen, transferring carbon dioxide. So it's the whole process added up, Jim. And I just believe 60 years what we've done to our food with these forever chemicals, these plastics, these phthalates, these have destroyed the systems.
So when you talk about carbohydrates, in this case, you're talking about natural good carbs, such as potatoes, vegetables, other
Fruit's
types.
The best, actually. There's a thing called the Randall cycle, which again, there's controversy in this, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Once you're not insulin resistant, is the mitochondria is this funnel, this tube at top of it. And when it's under 30% carbohydrates, around 30% carbohydrates, it will produce beta oxidation at the proper way for the fat to come in and the carbohydrates do the Krebs cycle. When you have too much fat, then what happens is you're just bombarding it. Again, I know there's controversy in that, but it sort of makes sense to me. Now, when you're just bombarded with simple sugars, the problem is the beta oxidation never occurs. And what happens, your body's insulin's function is to take sugar out of the blood and store it as glycogen, which is stored sugar. And that glycogen can only take so much in the cell, then that converts it to fat. We talked before of white fat and brown fat and how that all stores up. Right. So it's important to understand that process, the process, how that works. But when you talk about the optimal way, Jim, it's the balance of everything. It's just going to be very clear. It's the balance of everything. Once you have our body given the right things at proper proportions.
I read somewhere recently that the body in this world that we live in today is confused, because I'm just going to use this as an example. We don't know if we're getting Coke, Coke Zero, Diet Coke. There's all these different chemicals, and the body then is in an unpredictable state.
Right.
As a result, what happens?
You get diabetes. I mean, these fake sugars increase diabetes. You talk about this. McCullough talks about dysbiosis, bad gut thing. Complex carbohydrates, the bad gut bacteria like that. That causes dysbiosis. The simple sugars keep the healthy ones. So the fruits, the juices are simple like that. But I want to be clear. This is after insulin resistance is resolved, okay? If you're going to bias anyway, you bias towards fasting and ketosis.
15 minutes and 4 seconds, a record. Thank you, Dr. Brannon.
Thank you.